Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations will come to order. Today's hearing will examine the findings of our 8-month bipartisan investigation into the sexual abuse of women in federal prisons. Before we proceed, viewers are advised that this hearing will discuss sexual violence and other deeply disturbing issues that we are duty-bound to bring to light. Anyone seeking mental health assistance can call the nationwide hotline at 988 to connect with a trained counselor. 8 months ago, as chair of PSI, I launched an investigation into the sexual abuse of women in federal prisons. And with Ranking Member Johnson's support, our bipartisan staff reviewed extensive non-public Bureau of Prisons and whistleblower documents and conducted more than 24 interviews with senior BOP leaders, whistleblowers, and survivors of prison sexual abuse. Our findings are deeply disturbing and demonstrate, in my view, that the BOP is failing systemically to prevent, detect, and address sexual abuse of prisoners by its own employees. The subcommittee has found that Bureau of Prisons employees sexually abused female prisoners in at least 2/3 of federal prisons that have held women over the past decade. We found that BOP has failed to prevent, detect, and stop recurring sexual abuse, including by senior prison officials. At FCI Dublin in California, for example, both the warden and the chaplain sexually abused female prisoners. We found that BOP has failed to successfully implement the Prison Rape Elimination Act, or PREA. For example, 2 prisons where multiple BOP employees were abusing multiple women over an extended period, FCI Dublin and FCC Coleman, nevertheless passed or were found to have exceeded the PREA audit criteria, which are mandated by Congress and intended to detect the risk of sexual abuse in BOP facilities. In the case of FCI Dublin, the PREA compliance officer, the official specifically tasked with ensuring compliance with the federal law whose purpose is the elimination of prison rape, was himself sexually abusing prisoners. In the case of FCC Coleman in Florida, all female prisoners had been transferred out of the facility just 2 days before the PREA audit, making it impossible for the auditor to interview female prisoners despite the legal requirement that they interview inmates as part of the audit. Amidst more than 5,000 allegations of sexual abuse by BOP employees, we found that at least 134 against female detainees were substantiated by BOP internal investigations or by criminal prosecutions. And given the fear of retaliation by survivors of sexual abuse, the apparent apathy by senior BOP officials at the facility, regional office, and headquarters levels, and severe shortcomings in the investigative practices implemented by BOP's Office of Internal Affairs and the Department of Justice Inspector General, I suspect the extent of abuse is significantly wider. Indeed, we found that there is currently a backlog of 8,000 internal affairs cases at the Bureau of Prisons, including at least hundreds of sexual abuse allegations against BOP employees that remain unresolved. DOJ's Inspector General has found that BOP fails at times to properly credit allegations of sexual abuse brought by inmates. And multiple BOP employees who would later admit in sworn statements to sexually abusing prisoners have escaped criminal prosecution, due in part to weaknesses in the process by which BOP and the DOJ Inspector General work together to investigate such allegations. In fact, several officers who admitted under oath to sexually abusing prisoners were able nevertheless to retire with benefits. Let me be absolutely clear. This situation is intolerable. Sexual abuse of inmates is a gross abuse of human and constitutional rights and cannot be tolerated by the United States Congress. It is cruel and unusual punishment that violates the 8th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution and basic standards of human decency. In July of this year, the former director of the Bureau of Prisons testified before this very subcommittee and insisted that BOP was able to keep female prisoners safe from sexual abuse by BOP employees. We now know that that statement was unequivocally false. The purpose of today's hearing is to understand what's gone so badly wrong, to establish and examine the facts upon which we must build reform. Progress begins with the truth. It requires a full and unflinching examination of grievous failure. On our first panel, we will hear from 3 survivors of sexual abuse at the hands of BOP employees that occurred while they were incarcerated in federal prisons: Carolyn Richardson, Brianne Moore, and Linda De La Rosa. All of their abusers have since been convicted. The first-hand accounts of survivors are essential, and I am deeply grateful to them for coming forward to testify before the Senate. Their bravery will make it easier for others to tell their stories. Next, we will hear from Professor Brenda V. Smith of American University, a national expert on sexual abuse in custodial settings. We will ask her to put the survivors' testimony in a broader context. Finally, we will question 2 government witnesses: the Inspector General for the Department of Justice, Michael Horowitz, whose office both oversees BOP and investigates criminal misconduct by BOP employees, and the new BOP Director, Colette Peters, who began her tenure just 6 months ago in July. This hearing today is part of a 2-year bipartisan effort by this subcommittee, under my leadership, to investigate conditions of incarceration and detention in the United States, from corruption at the U.S. Penitentiary in Atlanta, to the Department of Justice's failure to count almost 1,000 deaths in custody across the country, to abusive and unnecessary gynecological procedures performed on women in Department of Homeland Security custody. Ranking Member Johnson, I thank you sincerely for your assistance in these efforts and your staff. And before I yield to the Ranking Member for his opening statement, it is important to acknowledge that law enforcement professionals working in our prisons have among the hardest jobs in our country. And I believe the vast majority of BOP employees share our goals of ending sexual abuse once and for all in U.S. prisons. I want to also state for the record that the subcommittee investigated sexual abuse of women in federal prison because of some unique considerations. Women are more likely than male prisoners to have suffered from trauma and sexual abuse prior to incarceration, and particularly susceptible to subsequent abuse in a custodial setting. However, the subcommittee fully acknowledges that sexual abuse is not limited to female prisoners. Finally, the subcommittee's findings, which form the basis for today's hearing, are laid out in a bipartisan staff report, and I ask unanimous consent that this report be entered into the record. Ranking Member Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You pretty well laid out the case, so I'll just ask that my opening statement be entered in the record.
Panel intro.
I think it's safe to say, based on your opening comments when you say that what we've uncovered is deeply disturbing, and it is, that I don't think anybody's looking forward to this hearing. I don't know about you, but any movie I watch where there's any kind of sexual assault, I have to turn it off. I can't watch it, and that's fiction. So we're going to be hearing some pretty horrific testimony today. It is the government's duty to incarcerate individuals, to punish people for crime, for keeping dangerous people away from the general public. And I don't want anything in this hearing to downplay that very serious responsibility of government. It's not a pleasant responsibility, but it's also a responsibility of government to make sure that where we do incarcerate individuals, that they're safe, that these types of rapes, these types of assaults don't occur. This is something that the federal government has recognized has been a problem dating back to 2003. I would say that was probably a pretty good faith effort to try and develop data, do audits, to try and prevent this. You'll never eliminate all of this. But I don't think there's any doubt that the government can do more, and looking at the the Inspector General's testimony, understanding what this administration is doing, it does appear that they are making good faith efforts to do more to try and prevent this. So, as deeply as disturbing and as how I'm not looking forward to hearing any of this, I agree with you, it's our responsibility. We can't turn our face from it. We have to face this. We have to do everything we can to eliminate it, recognizing what a difficult task that really is. So, Mr. Chairman, thank you, and thank all of our staff for doing a good job of looking into something that is not fun to look at, but that is our responsibility to look at and try and fix. So thank you.
Thank you, Ranking Member Johnson. We will now call our first panel of witnesses for this morning's hearing. Ms. Carolyn Richardson was formerly incarcerated in Metropolitan Corrections Center in New York City. Ms. Brianne Moore was formerly incarcerated at Federal Prison Camp in Alderson, West Virginia. Ms. Linda De La Rosa was formerly incarcerated at the Federal Medical Center in Lexington, Kentucky. And Professor Brenda V. Smith is a national expert on sexual abuse in custodial settings. I appreciate all of you for being with us today. Look forward to your testimony. The rules of the subcommittee require all witnesses to be sworn in. So at this time, I would ask all of you, please, to raise your right hand. Do you swear that the testimony you are about to give before this subcommittee is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
I do.
Let the record state that all witnesses answered in the affirmative. We are using a timing system today. Your written testimony will be printed in the record in its entirety. We would ask that you limit your oral testimony to approximately 5 minutes. You'll see a timer in front of you. And please confirm, if you can, with the help of your counsel if necessary, that your microphones are on as indicated by the red light before beginning. Ms. Richardson, at your convenience, we'll begin with you first, please.
Is it on? Hello, good morning. I would like to first express my sincere gratitude to Chairman Ossoff and Ranking Member Johnson for the opportunity to testify before you today. My name is Carolyn Richardson. I was incarcerated in federal BOP custody from August 2016 through October 2022, when my motion for compassionate release was granted on the grounds of extraordinary compelling circumstances. I suffered while I was in Metropolitan Correctional Center in New York. My testimony will focus on repeated sexual abuse that I suffered for several months at the hands of former correctional officer Colin Akparanta. While I struggle to speak about the abuse, I'm hopeful that my testimony will give voice to survivors in similar circumstances and help prevent sexual crimes in BOP facilities. In August 2016, I was indicted for my participation in a conspiracy to procure and distribute oxycodone. I am deeply remorseful for what I had done, which was fueled by my own addiction to oxycodone. I accepted a guilty plea and was sentenced to 12 years in prison, knowing that I would miss so many years with my 6 children. What I did not know was that I would come to suffer neglect and abuse in BOP custody that will forever change my life. Prior to my arrest, I had received an iris transplant, artificial iris implant, for cosmetic purposes. When I was taken into custody, I had normal vision and was in good physical health. Shortly after arriving in MCC, New York, in August of 2016, I began to experience complications with my transplanted irises. BOP personnel failed to provide me with timely medical care and caused my eyesight to deteriorate beyond repair. When I was finally taken to an eye surgeon in January 2017, I learned that due to the delay, I will be permanently legally blind and will require extensive eye treatment. Since then, I required periodic visits to outside hospitals, including 7 eye surgeries. Former Correctional Officer Akparanta was the BOP correctional officer tasked with taking me to these hospital appointments. I was in an extremely vulnerable state, physically, mentally, and spiritually due to my medical condition, and Akparanta preyed on this fact. When he took me to doctor's appointments, Akparanta made himself out to be someone I could trust. He talked to me about faith and spirituality, which was of central importance to me in coping with my loss of vision. He brought me food and medicine that I needed, but that I could not otherwise obtain. Right at my most vulnerable, I believed that here was a person who cared about me when no one else did. I was wrong. After several months, in around May 2018, Akparanta began to demand sexual favors in exchange for the food and medicine that he brought. He switched from working the day shift to night shift and came to my cell at night. I did not have a cellmate. He told me that my cell was in a perfect area because the security cameras could not see him coming or going. He was the only officer working the night shift in my unit, which consisted of approximately 40 female prisoners. He used a flashlight to signal to me that he was coming to my cell. I felt utterly powerless. I was a vision-impaired prisoner who was relying on Akparanta for basic life needs and transportation to medical appointments. For about 6 months, Akparanta regularly demanded sexual favors from me. He became increasingly rough and cruel in the way that he treated me. I told him that I did not like it, but he continued in his conduct. Before the assaults, he would act like he cared about me and would ask me what was wrong when I was looking down or sad. After sexual assaults began, he stopped showing any signs of caring, and all he wanted was sexual favors. I felt disgusted with him, but also with myself. I felt worthless, like I was something less than human that he could do with as he wished. When I indicated that I did not like what he was doing, Akparanta suggested that we would both get in trouble if I were to tell. I believed him. I was terrified that he or other BOP staff would retaliate against me or take away my privileges. I was afraid of being questioned and doubted. I felt that officers would stick together instead of believing me or caring for me, especially after Akparanta manipulated me. I felt that everyone had ulterior motives, but then I felt ashamed and blamed myself for not speaking up about the abuse. I felt like I should have yelled and screamed when he was sexually assaulting me, even though at that time I felt that I had no real voice. Further details of abuse can be found in Exhibit A, complaint filed in my civil lawsuit. Even though BOP has a zero-tolerance policy towards sexual abuse, in reality, it is extremely difficult for inmates to step up and report the abuse. It feels that there is no real protection from the guards retaliating against you under a pretext or harassing you with their authority. Even when the abuse is reported, inmates are kept in the dark about the progress of the investigation, and the repeated questioning is jarring and emotionally scarring to relive the trauma. I could personally gain a small measure of peace by cooperating with the criminal prosecution with Akparanta, resulting in his guilty plea, and by my civil lawsuit, which allowed me to gain information and knowledge about what happened. However, my hope is that no other inmate will have to suffer similar abuse, and that safeguards will be put in place to ensure that. I am appreciative of this opportunity to share my experience that I had in MCC. I stand here for other female inmates who have experienced sexual abuse, many of whom may feel that they are alone, without anyone to care about their story, like I used to feel. I hope in sharing this we can improve our system and prevent this from ever happening again. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Richardson, for your testimony. Ms. Moore, you may now present your statement.
Good morning. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak. I'm not an activist or someone who would normally use my voice like I am today. Speaking about my experience in such a public setting is incredibly hard. I'm willing to do so because other women are still in prison and I am out. I hope that they will not have to go through what I went through. I grew up in Illinois. My grandmother raised me, supported me, loved me. When I was 17, I had my daughter. I wanted to make money to support myself. I made the wrong decision. I sold drugs, crack cocaine to be exact. I was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. I accepted that because that was my choice at the time. I could have chosen to do something else, and I chose to do that. I got 10 years in prison, and I accepted that as well because as a result of doing that, consequences happen. So I just decided to take the time while I was in prison to improve myself, do my time so that I can get back home to my family. The prison guards tell you when you can sleep, when you can eat, when you can go. People in prison don't get to choose the location of the prison they're sent to. First, I was sent to Alabama. I was there for about 2 years. I was transferred to FPC Alderson. Both prisons are about 12 hours away from my home. It was difficult for my family to visit. Not being able to see my daughter and grandmother was devastating. I put in a request to transfer prisons as a closer to home transfer so I could be closer to home to my family. BOP officials have discretion to grant or deny requests, but I was determined to survive. I followed the rules. I took all the programs, opportunities available to me. I hoped the transfer request would eventually be granted. I knew that I needed to do my best for a chance at a transfer closer to home. Family is the most important thing to me. I was determined not to let prison break me. I was determined to return home a better mother. When I was in federal prison in Alderson in 2017, a captain began to target me. He took me to areas that were isolated in the prison where there were no cameras. He told me that he knew I wanted to transfer to another prison. He said the paperwork goes through me. In October of 2017, a building officer ordered me to go to the captain's office. The captain didn't summon me into his office. There was a secretary's office within the captain's office. When I arrived, there was no secretary. After the captain had me alone, he locked the secretary's door and closed his door behind him. He reminded me that the transfer went through him. He told me that if I didn't follow his orders, he would interfere with my transfer. He then raped me. To be clear, even before the captain spoke those words, I knew he had the power to prevent me from being transferred to a prison closer to my family, closer to my daughter. He was a captain with total control over me. I had no choice but to obey. I always had to follow orders in prison. It is hard to fully describe how this felt. The captain already had complete control over my day-to-day life and was now enforcing control over my body. Using my desire to see my children to threaten me to stay silent. The captain made it clear that if I wanted to transfer, I had to accept the abuse. I felt powerless. The abuse continued. Before my request could go through for a transfer closer to home, I escaped abuse when a prison close to home reopened, which was Pekin. When they asked for volunteers, I jumped on the opportunity to save myself. I left Alderson in December of 2017, and before I left, the captain knew I was leaving. He raped me one final time in total. He raped me 5 times, sexual assault, and on other occasions. After the abuse, I could not sleep for full nights for months. I had reoccurring nightmares that played over and over, like a broken record. I woke up in cold sweats. I would wake up crying after nightmares that the captain was trying to kill me for reporting the abuse. I isolated myself from others. I developed PTSD and had to seek mental health treatment. The captain abused his authority and power. And while he was raping me, he was raping other women in prison. We were not protected. I had no power to stop the abuse. The captain had total power over me, and he knew that. He knew that I had no control and could not say no. The captain knew that I knew that. He made sure to make sure I knew that. He made sure that he made sure to know that for me to know that he could make things worse for me. Even before this threat, I knew that if I reported him, I could be placed in solitary confinement or shipped out to another prison away from my family, which is something I didn't want to do. I saw this happen to other women in prison. They would tell their story, and they would be shipped, and the officer would still be there. I left Alderson in 2017. After the investigation began, the captain resigned and was prosecuted for sexually abusing me and other women at the prison. He pleaded guilty. I'm here today 5 years later, and I want you to know that I'm still suffering. This changes the course of my life. This has changed the course of my life forever. I'm in a different person physically, emotionally because of this. I'm still in mental health treatment. I've lost trust in the system. I knew prison would be tough. I accepted that. I would be punished for my crimes. It was not easy doing time. I was sentenced and put in prison for choices I made. I was not sentenced to prison to be raped and abused while in prison. This should not have happened to me, and it shouldn't have happened to anyone in prison. Speaking about this is not easy. The day I started to heal was the day I could talk about what happened to me without being afraid. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Moore, for your testimony, and for the benefit of all of our panelists, you may hear various sounds from the clock, and those have nothing to do with our hearing, but indicate to us what's happening on the Senate floor, so please don't be alarmed. Ms. Richardson, Ms. Moore, thank you so much for your testimony. Ms. De La Rosa, you may present your opening statement.
Chairman Ossoff, Ranking Member Johnson, and members of the subcommittee. I am a victim and survivor of sexual abuse by a federal correctional officer. That predator is now serving a 135-month sentence in a federal prison. In 2019, he sexually attacked me and 3 other women inmates at the Federal Medical Center in Lexington, Kentucky, which is a minimum security prison. It took 3 years to arrest, prosecute, and convict to sentence him. On the one hand, I am grateful for the efforts of those in the Department of Justice who did help me, who successfully put my attacker away. In particular, FBI victim specialist Cassie Young and Assistant U.S. Attorney Tashina Fannin. However, the Bureau of Prisons entirely failed. My attacker stayed at his job for years, even though BOP management and investigators knew he was a sexual predator. My life at FMC Lexington was a living hell. I believe my attacker had been investigated on numerous occasions for sexual crimes against female inmates. FMC Lexington management and investigators were well aware that female inmate victims were reluctant to come forward because they rightly feared retaliation, which took many forms, including transfers to different facilities, solitary confinement, loss of early release rights, and detrimental write-ups, loss of work privileges, and interference with vocational skills programs. I witnessed many examples of punishments handed out to other inmates that challenged or reported abuse by prison officials. The ongoing threat of retaliation stopped me and other inmates from filing complaints, let alone timely ones. Let me tell you what happened to me. I was transferred from Lexington. After reporting the sexual abuse that happened to me in Lexington, I was sent back to that facility. When I returned to Lexington, all of my belongings were missing. There were photos and letters from my son and daughter's father, both of whom had passed. They can never be replaced. When I returned, I also learned my attacker was still working at that facility. Incredibly, FMC Lexington management granted my attacker unrestricted and unsupervised contact with me on work details, which gave him one-on-one access to abuse or threaten to abuse me. Because of his position, my attacker could and did access my personal history, files, recordings of my telephone calls, and personal emails, giving him additional leverage to extract sexual favors and threaten my safety. The system failed at every level. Management, from the warden on down, repeatedly. They failed to monitor, supervise, discipline, and remove male correctional officers, predators, sexually abusing female inmates. Special Investigative Services officers supposedly charged with investigating staff misconduct failed repeatedly to investigate known and suspected predators. It is not enough just to call this horrible. I believe the problem is the old boys club. Prison staff, managers, investigators, correctional officers, they all work together for years, if not decades. No one wants to rock the boat, let alone listen to female inmates. There is no effective, independent oversight. The mission of the BOP is to protect society by confining offenders in the controlled environments of prison that are safe, humane, and appropriately secure. The agency failed me and my fellow inmates. We were knowingly confined in a facility that was unsafe, inhumane, and unsecure. And nothing was done. That was wrong. It should have never happened. Senators, I make one request: stop this from happening, from repeating. Now, nothing you are hearing today is new. You have the power and the authority to force the system to change. Please use it.
Amen.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Ms. De La Rosa. Dr. Smith, your opening statement, please.
First, I want to say how privileged I feel to be able to sit at the table with these survivors, because they are the ones who are doing the work to actually bring these issues to the fore. So I thank you for your courage and for being willing to tell what has happened to you in custody. Good morning, Chairman, Ranking Member Johnson, and committee members. I am a law professor at the American University Washington College of Law. I founded the project on addressing prison rape in 1993 after successfully representing a class of over 500 women who experienced physical, sexual, medical, and psychological abuse, as well as systematic inequality of services and opportunities in D.C. correctional facilities. I was appointed to the Prison Rape Elimination Commission in 1994 by House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi. Having sat on the Prison Commission on the PREA Commission for a decade, there is no question that the Prison Rape Elimination Act standards could, if followed, prevent the abuse of women in custody. At the same time, we know that while the PREA standards outline a successful approach to preventing, reducing, and punishing sexual abuse in custody, agencies, as these witnesses' testimony has identified, often do not follow the standards. Agencies complain that the standards are nitpicking and not consistent with their lived experience of people in custody or correctional settings. They also argue that women in custody are trying to game the system by claiming that they were abused. They claim that it would be too expensive or take too much time to follow the standards that would protect these women. They also argue that the standards are there, but you really don't have to pay attention until there's an audit. I'm familiar with Federal Bureau of Prisons facilities because many of the D.C. women I represented served their sentences in federal facilities and returned to the District of Columbia after discharge from federal facilities. These women spoke of abuse they had observed or experienced in a number of the federal facilities that are the subject of this hearing today. The most recent incidents involving FCI Dublin, MCC Brooklyn, FPC Alderson, and FMC Lexington are instructive, but they are not unusual. In other words, this is not new behavior. The abusers represent staff from a broad cross-section of the workforce. We have heard a chaplain, correctional officers, volunteers, and wardens. This points to abuse which is systemic in nature. What is clear from these incidents is that staff had unfettered, uninterrupted access to women. They abused with impunity and at will. They abused women in their offices, in corridors, out of sight of cameras, and in collusion with other staff. They had also abused the authority of their positions. One of the assailants was a chaplain, another a warden, people who we should be able to trust. These system actors and leaders had intercourse with the women, took nude images of them, and threatened them, as we've heard. One of the assailants ran the PREA training for preventing prison sexual assault while he was actively involved in abusing women prisoners. Given the systematic nature of this abuse, I have 3 recommendations that have the potential to provide women with greater protection from abuse. First, reform the audit process for the Prison Rape Elimination Act. PREA audits are supposed to identify problems or practices that affect the protection of people in custody from abuse. The current audit structure is not well designed to ensure its success. The requirements to become an auditor and the marketplace for auditors make it very difficult for anyone who does not work in corrections to become a DOJ certified PREA auditor. Having said that, we all know how hard it is for an institution to investigate itself. Next, agencies should hire and pay auditors agencies hire and pay the auditors who conduct the audit. So in reality, auditors work for the very agencies that they audit, making independence difficult. This creates a financial disincentive to identify problems. Next, another suggestion. Some agencies are audited through consortia, which means that state corrections agencies from one agency will send their staff to audit another state's facilities in a round-robin arrangement. This has not eliminated the potential for potential conflicts of interest in those arrangements. There's a quid pro quo. Finally, the cost of audits and the time that agencies or third-party auditing bodies that employ auditors allow for the conduct of audits do not adequately compensate auditors or allow the time necessary to conduct the audit methodology laid out by DOJ. If there were time, then what could happen is they could actually go through and look closely at these institutions, interview women, interview outside folks, and be able to find problems. Each of the facilities that are the subject of the hearing passed their audits with only minimal issues identified. Again, neutral auditors from an independent external auditing authority. Diversifying the auditor pool to include individuals with experience working with victims. There also needs to be ongoing training for auditors with a focus on auditing investigation standards and meaningful responses to retaliation. Because as we've heard, many of these women experienced and feared retaliation. I think the other thing that we also have to do is we have to address the conditions of confinement that create vulnerability for women in custody. Each of these women have identified common elements of vulnerability that relate to their victimization. Women, as you know, often bring multiple well-known vulnerabilities into the correctional setting. Past histories of childhood and adult physical and sexual abuse, poverty, involvement with powerful systemic actors like courts, child protection, housing, and immigration authorities that control their existence, their future, and their families. These factors create the levers of pressure that correctional staff employ to ensure compliance with both legitimate and illegitimate requests. Given this inequality of power, women bargain, capitulate, and comply, even as they fear for their lives, their freedom, and often for their families. Though there are constitutional limitations on cross-sex supervision, male staff still have found ways to have unfettered, unsupervised access to female inmates in their care. Clearly identifying and implementing better supervision strategies are in order. These strategies include increasing the numbers of female staff at every level, including leadership of women's correctional facilities. They also include decreasing the numbers of women in custodial settings. Women inmates are still incarcerated for primarily nonviolent offenses. Increasing the opportunities for supervision in the community would also help keep women safe from the pervasive sexual abuse culture we are discussing today. Finally, we need vigorous prosecution of these cases and enhanced penalties. The penalties for abusing a person in custody should be commensurate with the harm and damage they do to women in custody, their families, the community, and to our ideals of the rule of law. The sentences that prison sex offenders receive are not commensurate with the injury that they inflict or the harm they cause. In my view, the penalties should be comparable to the offenses for other individual victims who have been framed by the law as unable to consent. That would include people with developmental and other disabilities, children, and individuals in institutional settings, including prisoners. Finally, what I want to say is that the abuse of women in custody has created a stain on our society. It is a stain that I do not believe can be cleaned. But I hope that what we can do is repair and go forward and do better and create the conditions that we can provide safety for these women, provide safety for our communities, and actually improve the integrity of the system and actually have us be a community, a country that we can be proud of, a community that provides punishment where appropriate, but also justice for people who are abused in custody. And so again, I thank you for this opportunity, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Smith, and thank you to our first panel. Thank you, Ms. Richardson, Ms. Moore, and Ms. De La Rosa in particular, for having the strength to share these horrific ordeals that you endured with the U.S. Senate and the American public. I'd like to begin, please, by discussing the imbalance in power that underlies so much of this abuse. Ms. De La Rosa, you made reference to this in your remarks, the power over transfer, the power over all aspects of your life. How did that feel, and how did that play a role in making you vulnerable to this abuse?
Senator, I felt trapped, powerless. It wasn't, there were so many things that were taken from me, or times I was stuck in transit. I was held longer than I was supposed to be because of not being at a facility that could file my paperwork. I was in prison 6 months longer than I was supposed to be for this investigation. There's just so much we need to work on as far as the being able to report it.
And Ms. De La Rosa, the officer who assaulted you had previously been investigated
Yes, sir.
for sexually abusing other female prisoners,
Yes, sir.
but was still on the job.
Yes, sir.
So you're in a federal prison supervised by a male officer who had complete control over all aspects of your life,
Yes, sir.
unrestricted access to you while working,
Yes, sir.
who eventually pled guilty to sexual abuse, was sentenced to 135 months in prison.
Yes, sir.
While that abuse was ongoing, did you have any safe outlet to report it? Did you feel you had any safe outlet to report it?
No, sir. In Lexington, they have something called the penalty box, which is if an officer is under investigation, they put them in the phone and email room. So they listen to your phone calls and your emails. So the inmates would call it the hot box, but all officers called it the penalty box. So any way that you can report something to outside staff on the PREA signs throughout the prison is an email or a phone number. But you wouldn't feel safe reporting it when the officer you want to report is in the penalty box, listening to all of your phone calls and reading all of your emails. So no, at Lexington, I did not feel safe reporting.
What kind of retaliation did you fear?
All of the retaliation that I got. I was working on a 8,000-hour welding apprenticeship. I got transferred to a prison that didn't have that program. I was 46 hours from completing that program. I was transferred to the prison that I was scared to be at. I got transferred straight back there after reporting it. I got put back at the prison that I had reported. All of my belongings ended up missing. There were letters from my son and my grandpa, my pawpaw that passed, pictures over the last 9 years that I was incarcerated of my child coming to see me, and he passed away. I cannot ever get those things back. Letters he wrote me since he was 10 years old. I'll never get those things back, and they just came up missing. It's supposed to be they tell you that whenever you tell the officer that tell on an officer that it's completely confidential, but all of those things that happened to me afterwards were not coincidence. They were not.
Access and proximity to your family, how did they play a role in your fear of retaliation and the retaliation that you experienced?
Not being able to make phone calls, constantly being put in, once COVID started, quarantine. They would restart your quarantine, put you 21 days, no phone calls, no anything. So every time they move you, you have 21 days of not being able to contact your family, of not being able to have video visits with your kids. And for 9 years, that's what my kids looked forward to every week. They can do anything they want, and they do.
Ms. Moore, I'd like to ask you the same question, how access to family, proximity to family play a role. And if you wouldn't mind, Ms. Moore, just to ensure your microphone. Thank you.
Like she said, the same. Fear of not getting incident reports for nothing, not being able to call home, not being able to have contact with those video visits. I didn't necessarily have that happen where I was at, but I did fear retaliation, and which is why I never reported it while I was still at the prison. My whole goal was to try to get closer to home. I had put in a near home transfer before I went to Alderson, and because Alderson needed head count, I had to go there. So that's how I ended up at Alderson. So again, here I am trying to fight to get closer to my family so that I can have visits, because I had one visit while I was there for my daughter's birthday, and that was I did 7 years in prison. And so being able to talk to my family and my grandmother, because she's older and sickly, was very important to me. And my daughter was 7 when I went to prison. So that was very important to me. And like she said, the officers have a lot of control, you know? They have a lot of control, and we really don't have a say-so. I had already been in prison with women who had reported stuff and been sent to county jails where the food is just moldy and they're wearing underwear that are been previously wore. It's like nobody wants to be uprooted from a prison that you've taken time to do programs in and be sent to another prison because you report this stuff. So I'm sure that's why a lot of people don't report besides the retaliation. And I had already heard that he had been on an investigation before, but nothing was done. So, I mean, who was I to report something thinking that something was going to happen? And I didn't report it. And they called me after I transferred prisons. I was at a whole nother prison before they called me to ask about it.
Thank you, Ms. Moore. Ms. Richardson, I'll have a question for you in the next round. At this time, I'm going to yield to Ranking Member Johnson for his first round of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think Ms. Moore is really highlighting the most difficult aspect of this is the inability to report. The power that prison guards have over the prisoners and how, certainly some of them horrifically abuse that power. I just want to quick go down the table. So we know, Ms. Moore, you never did report the sexual assaults, correct? How did they ever come to light? Why are you sitting here before us? I mean, at what point in time? Was it during the prosecution of your abuser?
No, I guess the day after I transferred, the day after I left to go to Pekin from Alderson, he got walked off. And then maybe like a week or two, they called me at the prison I was at. Like, they called my counselor, and he came down and got me. And it was somebody investigating, and they wanted to, I don't know how they got my name, but they wanted to know what had happened. And at the time...
So somehow somebody had heard about your abuse. You might have talked to your fellow prisoners. I mean, did you ever talk to anybody about it other than...
Not really, no.
Somehow the investigators found out that you may have been abused, so then they contacted you, and then you told your story to the investigators.
Yeah, they asked if I wanted to tell my story, and at first I said no, and they gave me a couple of days to give them a call back. Yeah, and I don't know. I know they have cameras in the administration building, so I don't know if maybe they went through the cameras and seen that I had been there.
Ms. Richardson, what about you? Did you ever report this to anybody when you were in prison?
No, sir, I didn't. Actually, I have found out through a former inmate that Akpranta had been arrested for it, and that empowered me to come forward. But prior to that, I would have never told anyone because I was mandated to be there in MCC because I was on medical hold for my eyes, and I had already been sentenced.
So what about you, Ms. De La Rosa? Did you ever report this when you were a prisoner? Yeah.
I was moved from Lexington to Bryan, Texas to complete a program there. And when I was in Bryan, Texas, someone came and spoke with me and asked me about it. And I was reluctant to talk to them at first. And I ended up reporting it while I was in Bryan. And shortly after that, I was moved back.
So again, the only reason any of your situations came to light is because somebody investigating abuse came and talked to you.
Yes.
Ms. Smith, being an expert in this area, just, again, I'm not looking for a hard and fast answer. I doubt this has been researched, but it would seem that probably most cases of this kind of abuse go completely unreported. Would that be?
I think these cases are like sexual abuse in the community as well. Often those cases go reported as well. To be victimized means that you don't have power. And I think it is that sense of powerlessness that makes you think that either you can't report, nobody's going to believe you, or that nothing is going to happen to you. You will not be protected because you weren't protected in this situation.
So chances are, based on the statistics we have, something like 8,000 complaints that haven't been filed. That may still just be the tip of the iceberg.
Absolutely.
obviously, PREA, those audits haven't worked. I mean, you know, maybe they have in some cases, but they certainly have not eliminated sexual assaults.
So let's say PREA, aspects of it have worked, but some of the procedures have not. And so what I would say is that the audits, as I've testified, need a tremendous amount of work.
Can you think of any of you, can any of you think of any process of reporting where you might feel safe enough to actually try and report it? I mean, I have a hard time thinking of one, quite honestly. I mean, it's just again, it's just a devilish problem. You know, Ms. Smith, can you think of some kind of reporting? You know, when you find out the chaplain is doing the abuse of this, I mean, you think that'd be a place for somebody to go. You know, somebody set up inside the prison could be in a position of power. Could be. I mean, where's the solution lie here?
So I think there are a number of issues. Okay, so first of all, you start with being able to report outside of the institution.
Correct. So where would you go outside, and how would that be done when they're monitoring phone calls and email messages, that type of thing?
Well, you know, the fact is that there should be a phone line that you can use that is not monitored, right? That can go for a report out to a rape crisis center or some other, or an inspector general's office.
But the prison guards are going to know that you're using that phone.
Then
right? You know, I mean, that's
yes. But the fact is that the fact that there's a potential for abuse, as there currently is already, doesn't mean that you don't take those steps. I think you also have to protect people from retaliation. What you're also hearing here is that these women did not report because they actually had no confidence at all that they would be believed. No, again,
yes, the retaliation, the power is real.
Exactly.
The power is real to transfer you away from your family. The power is real. Mm-hmm. And so it really does come down to, if we're going to really prevent this, there's got to be some method of an anonymous reporting system that can't be abused for, you know, other things prisoners may be doing from inside the prison. I mean, there's the real devilish problem here.
Yeah, agree.
Any of the three witnesses, can you think of a reporting system that you would have had confidence in? Can you think of one? I'll start with you, Ms. De La Rosa. Can you think of something that, if it would have been available, you might have used to try and report this? Or is the power just so overwhelming and the threats and retaliation so horrific that you just had to bear it?
I honestly can't think of a way that you can report it that the staff will not know about.
Ms. Moore, can you think of one?
No.
Ms. Richardson?
No, sir, because one thing is for sure, it's that wrong or right doesn't matter. They all stick together.
So, Mr. Chairman, to me, there's the crux of the problem that needs to be solved. How can people inside prisons report without having a very high probability of being retaliated against the very people who are abusing them? Again, I think our next panel, that's be the main line of questioning I'll be pursuing there. But thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member Johnson. Senator Padilla.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As you have so well laid out, the purpose of today's hearing is to address the sexual misconduct that plagues U.S. federal prisons and the irreversible harm that it causes victims. While the various investigations tell us that abuse and exploitation has run rampant, there's no misconception that incidents are isolated to only the facilities explicitly mentioned. The horrendous reality is that detainee abuse is pervasive in facilities across the country. Now, my office has received far too many reports about California facilities suffering from dangerous living conditions, year-long delays in providing adequate health care in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, and yes, claims of sexual abuse and assault. Now, yesterday, Senators Durbin, Feinstein, Grassley, and I sent a follow-up letter to our original letter requesting more information from BOP concerning sexual misconduct allegations by its personnel. We reiterated that the Department of Justice must take immediate action to root out staff misconduct at BOP. This behavior cannot continue. The Bureau must act urgently to make meaningful, systemic improvements in facilities across the country. Now, it has been reported that incarcerated individuals who are victims of sexual misconduct and abuse may become overwhelmed with crippling anxiety and fear of retaliation if incidents are reported. Correctional facilities should not be contributing to an environment where victims are terrified of reporting abuse due to fear of retaliation. Now, one detainee in Dublin said that she was, and I'll quote, overwhelmed with fear, anxiety, and anger, and cried uncontrollably after enduring abuse and retaliation for reporting it. Ms. Richardson, Ms. Moore, and Ms. De La Rosa, I want to thank you as well for being here today and for your courage to share your stories. No one should have to suffer what you have, and your testimony today is invaluable as we work to ensure that these abuses are prevented in the future. Would you each be willing to share a little bit about your mental health journey? How you've been able to manage, how you've been able to cope. Again, it's taken courage for you to be able to tell your story publicly, and to be here today to participate in this hearing. If you can just talk a little bit about what the impacts have been, what resources or support you've been able to access to help. Ms. Richardson?
I was diagnosed with PTSD, and I believe it's called persistent anxiety disorder. Since that diagnosis, I've been on medication. And also, my spirituality comes in play, what keeps me grounded somewhat.
Thank you. Ms. Moore?
I continue to see a therapist at the prison that I transferred to, and then the prison after that. And then when I got home, I've been out 3 years. I continue to see a therapist. I have not really had anxiety since I've been out of prison because I feel like I'm not contained anymore. And so the retaliation is not as scary as it is in there. But with this, like before, when they asked me if I wanted to do it, at first I was afraid because I felt like, what kind of retaliation can I get from this, So my anxiety has been high the last couple, just knowing that I'm coming here to do this. But as I told my attorneys, I'm not the only one that's went through this. And if my story can help somebody else that may be going through it or could potentially go through it, I decided to put my anxiety to the side. And like she said, my faith helps me. I have 2 children, and I work every day, so I'm trying not to use it as a crutch and let it control my life. I'm trying to keep control of my life, keep the control of my life since I've got it back after what happened. And I'm just trying to move on with my life, but a part of this is a part of me healing by doing this today.
Thank you. Ms. De La Rosa?
Anxiety has definitely been my biggest struggle. I was a lot more anxious prior to his incarceration. During his trial, they They didn't even have him incarcerated. He got a bond and he was out. And my anxiety was so high during that time. But since he's been incarcerated, I feel much safer.
So, thank you. Thank you all for, again, being able to speak about that publicly, because we know there's still a lot of stigma around mental health and accessing, whether it's seeing a counselor, a therapist, or medication that we have to overcome, because it's okay. It's okay to not feel okay. Professor Smith, wondering if in the brief time we have left, you can begin to discuss more generally the mental health impacts of correctional officer abuse on detainees, both while they're in custody and when they're no longer incarcerated.
Well, what we know is that a significant number of women who come into custodial settings come in with past histories of abuse and trauma. And that abuse, the abuse, as these women have talked about, in custody actually highlights that deepens that existing trauma that they already have. And as we know, there are not a lot of resources available for women in custody to actually deal with the trauma that they're experiencing, that they experienced before they were in custody, while they are in custody, and also that they will experience upon their return. And so I think that it's really important that we really enhance those services in custodial settings and actually after women return to the community.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Padilla. Ms. Richardson, you stated in court, you described a meeting in 2017 where a BOP supervisor told you and other assembled female prisoners, quote, "I don't want to hear nothing about my officers touching you." And another officer who ignored pleas for help from a group of female prisoners and said that your abuser, quote, "will eventually get caught." What was it like to hear those things, and what, in your view, was it about MCC New York and the environment there that contributed to that culture?
Well, two of those statements weren't actually made by me. It was made by my the other ladies on the complaint. But I did hear one of the statements by Counselor Lewis, and at the time it didn't register to me what it actually meant. But the dynamics of that place, like I said before, you know, wrong or right doesn't matter. They all stick together.
Unpack that a little bit for us, please, Ms. Richardson.
Well, just like you said the statement of that was Counselor Lewis. She's saying, well, you know, I don't want to hear anything about what my officers are doing to you ladies. Everybody wants to cover their own butt, so they basically stick. You know, they don't do anything about what they hear. They sort of like sweep it under the carpet.
Thank you, Ms. Richardson. Ms. Moore, you explained how the captain would take you to isolated areas where there weren't security cameras. Talk a little bit about the presence of cameras in the prison, the lack of coverage of certain areas in the prison, and how that contributed to an environment where you and others were vulnerable.
There weren't. Well, I was at a camp, so the cameras are very. There's not very many at a camp. Maybe they have some in the buildings, but Alderson, if you've ever been there, is really big, and so there's 75% of the place is not covered by cameras. And then, you know, in his office, of course, his office doesn't have a camera in it, you know, and then there are certain parts in the building where we slept where like the counselors and the case managers worked that didn't have cameras in those areas, you know. So being at a camp, they say it's supposed to be low security, so I'm assuming that's why they don't have as many cameras. But for things like this, I feel like there could be more, even if it's just some outside, you know, just more. And then, you know, what can you do about a camera in his office? You know, he's a captain. Of course, they're probably not going to put a camera in his office, you know? So it's like he had the perfect opportunity being there. with little visibility for anyone to see.
Thank you, Ms. Moore. Professor Smith, let's talk a little bit about the Prison Rape Elimination Act. And it's perhaps obvious given the title, but what is the purpose of the Prison Rape Elimination Act?
The purpose is not only prevention, but also detection, punishment, and also to create the conditions, whether it's the law, whether it's policy, whether it's related to prosecution, to end sexual abuse of people in custody. Yeah, that is the aim.
And Professor Smith, one of the most concerning aspects of our investigation is that we found these PREA audits that were conducted during times when there was ongoing sexual abuse inside Dublin, inside Coleman. And yet, the auditors found and stated in these reports that both facilities met or exceeded every PREA standard. Talk a little bit about that. And I have to ask the question, do these audits work?
I think as I testified, there are significant problems with the audit, and there need to be substantial improvements. Currently, we have we have prisons. You know, as I've mentioned, we have prisons who are we have the people who are supposed to be being audited auditing themselves, essentially. And so what happens, there's not a great deal of diversity. What we have is we have auditors who formerly worked at prisoners as wardens. We have auditors we have agencies who audit each other, and so there's a disincentive for them to actually find another agency out of compliance, because they're concerned that when they are audited, that they will be found out of compliance. And so I think that what is really important is having neutral auditors, to have people who are clearly not a part of that system, and also to have audits of the audits, to actually go behind in the same way that you did in that report, to actually identify, yes, there were 0 complaints here, but we looked at case law and we looked at actually criminal complaints, and this doesn't match up with what you're reporting. And so I think that it has to be more than the actual audit, but there actually has to be some other independent verification of that audit, which would include, as the committee has done here, looking at whether there are complaints, looking at litigation, talking to external organizations, talking to people who are outside of the system.
Professor Smith, my time remaining is brief, if you can attempt this one. Do you think it would be helpful to have more women working in facilities that incarcerate women?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I testified to that as well. I mean, the presence of female staff. I mean, in fact, one of the huge issues that come to bear in each of these situations is how did these male staff actually have unfettered access to women inmates? They should have been, a door should have been open, female staff should have been walking through, and in many places, what has happened is female staff are the only ones who are allowed to perform certain services or perform in certain ways with female inmates.
Thank you, Professor Smith. Ranking Member Johnson, do you have further questions for this panel?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As Ms. Smith pointed out earlier, obviously rape and sexual assault occur throughout society. You can actually argue inside the walls of a prison might be one place where you could actually prevent it from happening. I mean, there's guards, there are people, people there to enforce the law. You could argue that it just shouldn't happen. I think with my last round of questioning here, I just want to try to get some sense of how pervasive it is within prison. Obviously, in society, there's so many reasons why rape victims don't come forward. You have those same dynamics occurring with prisoners, plus you have the even more horrific power and fear of retaliation, which would prevent victims from coming forward and really blowing the whistle on it. So I guess what I'd like to ask the three witnesses is, within the spectrum of isolated to pervasive, you know, having talked to fellow prisoners, do you have any sense whatsoever that this is you were unfortunately a victim of an isolated problem? And maybe it's different for every facility. It probably is different for different facilities, but do you have any kind of sense whatsoever in terms of what kind of problem we're dealing with here? Just something, again, that you were the unfortunate victim of an isolated case, or you're just unfortunate victim of something that's pervasive within the prison population of women's prison? I'll start with you, Ms. Richardson.
Well, I was one of 7 victims from MCC that the officer pled guilty to, and that was in the pretrial facility that I was housed in for 4.5 years when I was transferred to Tallahassee, Florida. Prior to me just leaving in October, there's 3 inmates there that was sexually assaulted by an officer which was walked off the compound. So it seems to be at all of the facilities.
Yes, it's occurring. Again, I'm trying to get some sense. You know, there are, what is total prison population women? Something like 17,000. Is that from my briefing? But anyway, I'll go to Ms. Moore. What is your sense? Isolated or just pervasive throughout prison systems?
I think it's throughout the prison systems as well. The captain had more than just me. I think I never knew the ladies, but there were other women on his case as well that came forward for him to get prosecuted. So it's not isolated.
But again, you're kind of dealing with the same information we're looking at right now in terms of what's been, in the end, prosecuted, what has come to light. I'm trying to get some sense for how through conversations with fellow prisoners. Do you have any sense whatsoever? I'll go to Ms. De La Rosa for that.
Pervasive throughout. It's way more people than the people who have just reported. It's throughout the system.
So that would also imply there are a lot more perpetrators.
Yes.
Well, again, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate you forcing us to look at something we have to look at. We just do. And we really do need the Department of Justice to step up the plate, examine this carefully, utilize different tools, recognize that the PREA-Act certainly has not eliminated this, and try and we need more of a sense to figure out really how pervasive this is and what we can really do. And I'll again point out that the real problem is how can prisoners have any confidence to report? The other thing that I found bizarre, and we'll cover this up there, we'll cover this at the next panel too, is the strange situation if the Office of Internal Affairs compels a guard to do an interview, and they find out that wrongdoing has occurred. That's a get out of the jail free card. So I think we're going to have to obviously look to the Office of Inspector General to step up their investigations, because the Supreme Court has ruled on that. That's the way it's going to be, compelled testimony. So we're going to have to figure out a better way to investigate, because that's one of the ways you reduce this, at least, would be more consistent prosecutions and very severe penalty, which, by the way, penalty includes incarceration. But even those perpetrators deserve to be in a prison that is safe and where they're not abused as well. So again, this is a big problem. Like, as I said in the outset, it's not a fun problem to look at. It just isn't, but it's one that we have to. And again, I appreciate the fact that you're forcing us to look at it.
Well, Ranking Member Johnson, I very much appreciate your consistent support and engagement in this investigation and that of your staff. I think it sends a powerful message to the department that there is strong bipartisan will to address this crisis, and we'll have the opportunity to question government witnesses in the next panel. I want to take this opportunity to thank each and every one of you, and I want to thank in particular you, Ms. Richardson, Ms. Moore, and Ms. De La Rosa for coming forward, for having the strength and courage to address the U.S. Senate in this setting, to speak publicly about what you endured, to help senators and the entire Congress to understand the dynamics that led to this exploitation, that led to the horrific ordeals that you suffered. Please know that we will continue to work on the basis of what you shared with us, and I believe that the courage you've demonstrated today will inspire and empower others as well to share their stories. So it's with gratitude and admiration for your courage that I thank you. And Professor Smith, thank you for lending your expertise to the Senate today, and I hope that as Senator Johnson and I continue to work together to identify solutions either at the administrative or legislative level, that you'll remain engaged with us. So at this time, we will excuse this panel. Thank you again for your contributions. We'll take a brief recess and set up for the second panel of government witnesses. Michael Horowitz serves as the Inspector General for the Department of Justice. Colette Peters serves as the Director of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. The rules of this subcommittee require all witnesses to be sworn in, so at this time, I would ask you both please stand and raise your right hand. Do you swear that the testimony you are about to give before this subcommittee is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? I do. Thank you. You may be seated. Let the record show that both witnesses have answered in the affirmative. Your written testimonies in full will be printed in the record, and I would ask that you seek to limit your oral testimony to approximately 5 minutes, as indicated by the clocks in front of you. Mr. Horowitz, we'll hear from you first.
Thank you, Chairman Ossoff, Ranking Member Johnson, members of the subcommittee. During my tenure as Inspector General, I've identified for each of the 5 Attorneys General and Deputy Attorney General that I've worked with that the safety and security of the federal prisons is one of the most important and compelling issues facing the Department of Justice. So I'm particularly pleased to be here today to talk about these issues and to work with the committee on how to address them. I also want to thank you for the important and impactful report that was released today by the bipartisan work and through the bipartisan work of the committee. I also want to take a moment to thank Ms. De La Rosa, Ms. Moore, and Ms. Richardson for their courageous and compelling testimony that we heard in their first panel, and for their bravery in cooperating with my office as we pursued the wrongdoers who committed the heinous acts that they described. Because of their assistance, those corrupt employees were held accountable in federal court and are no longer able to terrorize other BOP inmates. No inmate should ever suffer sexual abuse in prison, and as your report details, female inmates are particularly vulnerable to such assaults. We must do everything we can to eradicate such behavior, and you have my commitment that the OIG will continue to make this fight against sexual assault one of our highest priorities. Indeed, our office regularly commits about 50% of our investigative resources to addressing criminal and administrative wrongdoing by BOP employees, an outsized percentage of resources, given that the BOP accounts for about 30% of the department's employees. However, I only have about 113 agents nationwide, which means I have the equivalent of 56 agents available to handle the thousands of allegations we receive across the 123 federal prisons. It's clear that more independent oversight is needed, and that's why we've asked Congress, and I'm working with Congress to try and get more resources to do that kind of work. We continue to see widespread instances of sexual assault, most recently, as was discussed earlier, at the BOP's prison in Dublin, California, an all-female prison. Just last week, the jury convicted the former warden of sexually assaulting 8 inmates at the prison. The investigation that we've conducted with the FBI has also identified other Dublin employees and charged other Dublin employees, including the former chaplain. And we have a very active and ongoing investigation there. These problems didn't just happen overnight, and the BOP must do more to prevent and detect them before they become endemic at other institutions, as we've seen in Coleman and others, as we heard in the first panel. In short, these are substantial problems that need immediate attention and action, and the subcommittee's report and the recommendations in it are going to be very valuable as we move forward to address them. We're also pleased by the recommendations contained in the Deputy Attorney General's recent report by her task force on BOP sexual assault. Those recommendations need to be implemented promptly. I've also had several positive discussions with Director Peters since she became the director in July of this year. Let me mention some additional issues that I'm hoping the committee will consider. First, the BOP needs to be and take more timely and effective action in holding accountable corrupt BOP employees. Second, the BOP needs to rely on credible inmate testimony in its administrative misconduct proceedings. Third, the BOP must repair and improve its camera systems. Fourth, the BOP needs to implement an effective staff search and contraband policy. And one of the things that I'm hoping that the committee will consider is a potential increase in the penalties for contraband smuggling. In some instances, those are merely misdemeanors. When contraband is smuggled into BOP prisons to provide contraband to inmates that they are grooming for their sexual assaults. That should be addressed. I'm also taking several steps within the OIG to ensure that we can do a better job in our office investigating and pursuing these allegations. I've included them in my testimony, among them using data analytics to identify problems early on, like you have recounted in FCI Coleman and what occurred there. We will take more action, and I am assuring this committee that we will take those steps. I appreciate the support of this committee and of the Congress in pursuing our work and allowing us to conduct our investigations. We will use all the tools you have provided us to take action to prevent this scourge from occurring. I look forward to answering your questions today, and thank you again for the important work that you've done.
Thank you, Inspector General Horowitz. Director Peters.
Good morning, Chairman Ossoff, Ranking Member Johnson, and members of the committee. I am honored to appear before you as the Bureau's 12th director and to provide leadership to corrections professionals in the largest corrections agency in the country. After 30 years in public safety, working in roles from victim advocate and Inspector General to serving as the director of the Oregon Department of Corrections, I can tell you that the topic of this hearing is of immense importance to me, and I thank the committee for their years of work, and I especially thank the victims who are here today, bravely sharing their heartbreaking and compelling stories. I welcome accountability and oversight, and I welcome this hearing. We must come to this work with our arms wide open. Our work with Congress, the Office of the Inspector General, and the Government Accountability Office, among others, has helped us identify and address areas of concerns within our agency. Sexual misconduct by Bureau employees is an issue of critical importance, and I also appreciate this committee's support in this area. With your oversight, I see this moment as an opportunity to work together to make our facilities safer for the people in our care and custody. I believe we all want the same thing, a safe, humane, and effective Federal Bureau of Prisons. Any kind of misconduct, especially sexual misconduct by Bureau employees, is always unacceptable and must not be tolerated. The vast majority of our employees do come to work every day, ready to serve in complex and challenging jobs that can also change lives and make our community safer. I join these dedicated employees in being horrified by the small number of employees who engage in inappropriate, egregious, and criminal behavior. We must hold accountable those who violate that public trust, and we are strengthening our processes, realigning resources, and clearly communicating those expectations. Our work is to combat sexual misconduct, and that work is complex and must include prevention, reporting, investigation, discipline, and also prosecution. We must begin with assessing and then changing the culture and the environment in our facilities where need be. At all women's facilities, we want to ensure gender-responsive, trauma-informed practices are being followed. We must train all Bureau employees on their obligation to report misconduct. Since leadership is essential to creating the appropriate culture, we are also examining how we select, supervise, and support wardens in our women's facilities. I believe that detection and accountability is critical to deterrence. We will leverage both technological and human resources to better detect and prevent sexual misconduct. On the technological side, we are working on upgrading camera technology and usage. I have also been very clear in my communication to Bureau employees that while I am proud of those who come to work every day dedicated to our core values and mission, for those that aren't, we will fetter them out and hold them accountable, up to and including termination and conviction. We will also not tolerate any acts of reprisal. There is no and should be no limitation on who may submit allegations of misconduct, and our Office of Internal Affairs works closely with the Office of Inspector General and other entities to ensure all obligations are reviewed. In this vein, we are looking into collaborating with formerly incarcerated individuals and using the lessons learned from their experience. Myself and other Bureau employees have already participated in 2 very powerful listening sessions, which included formerly incarcerated individuals. We, too, are bolstering and reorganizing investigative resources and personnel to support the Office of Office of Internal Affairs in conducting timely, thorough, and unbiased investigations. This includes adding more than 40 employees to the OIA team, realigning reporting structure for those agents, and training investigators in trauma-informed techniques. When criminal misconduct is uncovered, it is important that people are held accountable, either administratively or criminally, if legal action is warranted. That is why I would like to publicly thank the Inspector General for his commitment to ensuring the Bureau's success through the timely investigations. And I'd like to thank the Deputy Attorney General for giving very clear direction to all U.S. attorneys on prioritizing prosecution of criminal misconduct in the Bureau. As I've said many times, and I will repeat here today, I believe in good government. I believe in transparency, and I know we cannot do this work alone. We must come to this work, as I've said, with our arms wide open. Chairman Ossoff, Ranking Member Johnson, and members of the subcommittee, I am honored to speak on behalf of the Bureau and its dedicated employees. This concludes my opening statement, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Director Peters, and I'll begin. Director Peters, you were appointed over the summer. You've been on the job about 5 months, correct?
That's correct.
So I think it's important to acknowledge, and I know Ranking Member Johnson and I think both acknowledge you are new in this post. The overwhelming majority, if not all, of the events presented in our report occurred prior to your tenure. Nevertheless, as you and I discussed in your confirmation, or your first hearing rather, in the Judiciary Committee, the buck now stops with you. And one thing I want to just state at the outset of your responses to our questions today is that while we are deeply interested in your plans for reform, and you'll have every opportunity to present them, the purpose of this hearing as well is to examine what happened in the past, what went wrong, and what's been broken at the Bureau of Prisons. And you, in your capacity leading the BOP today, are here to help us understand that. So I hope that's clear, Director Peters.
Very clear, Senator.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And same to you, Mr. Horowitz.
Yes. Yes.
So Ranking Member Johnson made reference to this in his questions to our prior panel, defining the scope of the problem. We agree that's vital. What we found in the course of this investigation is that in 2/3 of the federal prisons that have housed women in the last 10 years, there has been sexual abuse of female prisoners by BOP employees. And I believe this number is likely significantly higher, both in the number of facilities and the number of cases, in part because of the severe deficiencies we've identified in terms of how, Director Peters, the Office of Internal Affairs handles investigations of allegations of sexual abuse, the limitations that you've acknowledged, Inspector General Horowitz, in your office, as well as the widespread fear of retaliation and a culture of impunity that we've seen prevail in multiple of these cases. I mean, we start with Dublin. It was widely known before much broke into the official record that there was a serious problem at Dublin. There have been multiple convictions. There are over a dozen ongoing criminal investigations. This went on for years. And the warden and the chaplain were sexually abusing prisoners. Before Dublin, multiple officers abusing multiple female inmates at other facilities, MCC New York, MDC Brooklyn, FCC Coleman. Every few years, despite the culture of impunity, despite the fear of retaliation, it has broken in to the public consciousness that there's a serious problem, and yet nothing systemic has been done to address it. And in fact, when we asked senior BOP personnel what was done after the Brooklyn facts came to light, what was done after the Coleman facts came to light, little or nothing in the way of a systemic attempt to address the issue. So I want to understand from you, Director Peters, why? I mean, you've been in the job now for 5 months. Presumably you have debriefed senior leadership that's outgoing, yes?
Yes, Senator.
You've inspected prisons.
Yes.
You've discussed these issues with regional directors, with wardens. You've, I presume, done your best to understand this so that you can be effective at addressing it. Before we get into what you're going to change, why is it that for 10 years, despite it being known to BOP leadership there was a serious problem, nothing was done to address it in any kind of systemic or effective way?
Senator, I wish I had a good answer to that question. What I can tell you is that when you look at the institutions that you're highlighting, the Brooklyn, MCC New York, Dublin, and you see an institution that has been riveted with cases. It's hard to explain. It's hard to understand how systemic changes were not implemented. When you look at the power differential inside an institution, there is no ability for an individual who is carcerated to consent to any form of sexual relations. And then when you look at individuals like a warden and like a chaplain, there's something even more exponential there in terms of that power differential. And so I find that that situation is absolutely egregious, and it is about the systemic change. That's what we need to look at, Senator. We need to be able to look in all of the categories that I mentioned in my opening statement. We have to figure out how to prevent this. We have to figure out how to better investigate, streamline resources, hold people accountable, and work to prosecute those who deserve prosecution.
Thank you, Director Peters. I appreciate that. And again, I want to stipulate, I think it's important for the public to be reminded that the events that we're investigating have predated your tenure. Nevertheless, I think you have to understand why systemic change was neither attempted nor succeeded. Because for you to reform this vast bureaucracy, which is diseased, and this subcommittee has done other work looking at the BOP in the last few months. We looked at corruption and misconduct in Atlanta, for example. And we examined in the course of that hearing a lack of accountability from the very top. You need to understand that in order to change it. Here's something I want to just put to you and get your response, Director Peters. We in the course of conducting this investigation, heard different things from folks at different levels of your organization. So, for example, we interviewed a former warden at Dublin, not the one who's been convicted, but a former warden at Dublin, who described this as, and this is a quote from his interview, bad people making bad choices. He identified it as, and I'm now paraphrasing, but the gist of it was a few bad apples, people making the wrong choices, not so much systemic. He denied there was a culture of abuse. But we spoke with your Chief of Internal Affairs, who described a culture of abuse, who described it as systemic at that facility. I mean, have you, for example, talked to the regional director who was in charge at the time to understand how it could have evaded their attention that this was ongoing at Dublin for so long? And how is it that there are these different views within your own bureaucracy? You got a former warden saying just a few bad apples, and your own internal affairs folks saying it was a culture of abuse.
Thank you, Senator. I have a tough time understanding how the warden drew that conclusion based on the facts as I observe them today. I have not spoken to that warden. I have had lengthy conversations with the administrator responsible for our office internal affairs, and we agree. That is a culture of abuse. That is a culture of misconduct, and that culture needs to be reset in order to ensure the safety and security of those in our care and custody. And I think we do have systemic changes in the works that will help us reset that culture there and throughout the Federal Bureau of Prisons.
Thank you. Ranking Member Johnson.
So, Director Peters, how do you determine whether it's a few bad apples versus a culture of abuse? I mean, how do you make that determination systemically? You know, obviously, when you've got the warden and the chaplain, you kind of figure that's probably a culture. But again, you've got a number of facilities. How do you make that determination?
Thank you, Senator. I think that the Bureau is now putting together cultural assessments where we have teams who are trained to come in and assess that culture. I think some of the signs are absolutely, Senator, like you said, when it's high-level officials engaging in this egregious criminal acts, there's clearly a culture. But also when you find those who are incarcerated who openly tell our cultural assessment team that they don't feel comfortable coming forward. They don't feel like there are avenues to report in a way where they can report without fear of reprisal. And it's those sorts of warning signs that we want to be able to find during these cultural assessments so that we don't have a Dublin repeat again, and so that those individuals in our care and custody are safe. And so we look forward to continuing those cultural assessments and ensuring that we are taking all of that data into account.
Do you have any idea in terms of how somebody who's being sexually abused inside a prison can report that without having a very legitimate fear of retaliation or reprisal? Can you think of anything? You know, understanding you have a hotline, well, they'll know they're using the hotline. You provide confidential communication, well, that'll be abused by drug traffickers. I mean, it's tough not to crack. Do you have any possible ideas of what might work?
Thank you, Senator, and I appreciated those questions directly to those who are formerly incarcerated and now victims of these egregious acts that you asked earlier this morning. I think that the answer is there has to be many avenues. First, we have to create a culture where they have developed relationships with the frontline officers and they do feel comfortable talking to them. When absent that, we have to develop a culture where family members and loved ones know that they too can report internally or externally. And I think the key, and as we listened to the women talk this morning, that ability to report independently without any tracking from the Bureau directly to the Inspector General's office is a key component of being able to crack that nut.
Yeah, but again, they're in prison. How can they report without people knowing? And then, let's face it, they report in, after a certain amount of time, all of a sudden, people are asking questions. I mean,
that's right. And so right now, the way they can report directly to the Inspector General without us knowing is through true links. So they're able to send an email directly to the Inspector General outlining their allegations and their concerns. And you're absolutely right. Then investigators come, Senator, and questions are asked. And so the information is inside the institution. And so it can't just be reporting alone. It has to be things like the convictions that we're seeing out of California so that our Bureau employees know that if they engage in this type of behavior or engage in acts of reprisal, that they will be held accountable. And I think that level of prosecution and accountability will allow us over time to develop an environment where individuals can come forward without that fear of reprisal.
In the PREA audits, how many inmates are what percentage of the inmates are questioned during those things in a confidential manner?
Senator, I do not know the answer to that question.
Okay, I mean, that would certainly be one way, a more all-inclusive survey, surveillance audits, that type of thing. How many personnel do you have in the Office of Internal Affairs?
I don't know the total number, but I do know that we just added more than 40 positions to the Office of Internal Affairs in order to help us.
So it's
streamline.
probably in the hundreds?
Yeah.
I mean, Inspector General Horowitz, do you know?
I don't know the exact number in the BOP's operations. I do think I'd be guessing. I'm not sure exactly how many they have in their internal affairs. As I said, we have about 113 agents around the country devoting about half their time to this. And if I could answer that, I think you've hit on, as you talked about in the first panel, a critically important question. As Director Peters said, there is this ability to send an email directly to us that is anonymized, that cannot be traced. The question, of course, is who's watching over people's shoulders when that occurs? Where's the terminal? What happens when we respond? Because obviously we want to respond, so that has to be addressed. But I think one of the things that's critically important is the culture question we've been talking about, because as you know from having run a business, the question is, why aren't the employees stepping forward? Why do we need the inmates, and only the inmates, to step forward? It's a very serious problem. We have the warden, a chaplain, and many other employees at the Dublin prison. We could talk about Brooklyn, MDC Brooklyn. We could talk about MCC New York. We could talk about FCI Atlanta. We could talk about Thompson Prison. We can keep going, right? Why aren't those employees coming forward when they've got a predator among their fellow employees? They're the first line. They're the eyes and ears, along with the inmates. They're the ones who need to come forward. There needs to be that ability and accountability for people who are responsible and for people who should have come forward, including supervisors.
Director Peters, I know just local law enforcement, for a host of reasons, are having a very difficult time recruiting. You know, the defund police movement, the blame cops first, that type of thing. What kind of recruitment issues are you having within the Bureau of Prisons?
Thank you for the question, Senator. First, I can't agree more with what the Inspector General just said. Our employees have an obligation to come forward. And I think it ties directly into your next question, which is how do we hire the right people to come in who want to change hearts and minds, who want to do the right thing, who have those core values, who have those ethics. And if ever there was a time where it was difficult to hire at the Bureau of Prisons, it's now, for all the reasons you just mentioned, Senator. It was difficult to hire before the pandemic. Then the pandemic hit and made these jobs even less attractive, as well as the other issues that you just raised in the field of law enforcement. And so one of our top priorities is recruitment and retention strategies, and we've been working diligently internal with the Bureau, but we've also reached out to 2 organizations and contracted with them in hopes that we can rely on their expertise to improve our ability to hire not just people, but the right people for this business.
So if you'll indulge me for one more point, maybe question. There is a real problem of false reports, correct? Do you either of you have any indication of how significant a problem that is? I mean, let's face it, you are talking about people who have committed crimes. Some of them maybe aren't the most honorable or most honest, and not a bad way to retaliate against a guard either. So that it's how do you know, how does Bureau of Prisons, how does Office of Internal Affairs, how does Office of Inspector General try and sift through the true claims versus the fraudulent ones?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, Senator. It's something actually, having done police corruption cases back when I was a federal prosecutor in New York, was one of the key questions also, which is you had a lot of allegations against the bad cops, but you had allegations against the good cops because the drug dealers knew that was a convenient way, or thought it was at least, to impact them. And so you have to be very careful as investigators to understand that. And frankly, the only way you do it is by getting the complaints, carefully vetting them, and not jumping to a conclusion. And that's one of the challenges we face also, particularly because it's so challenging to get into the prison to see if there's corroboration. And this is where cameras come in. Cameras are, I could talk about this for days. It's not only on sexual abuse, it's on assaults in prison. How many times do we get a complaint that an inmate was assaulted by another correctional officer? A lot of those are false because they had an injury and it was their own doing. We don't have a camera. There's no excuse for that, none whatsoever.
So, by the way, I completely agree with that, and that is just table stakes. That that has to be fixed. The cameras have to be fixed. They've got to be provide as much as possible, 100% coverage. That would take care of an awful lot of this. And in the scheme of things, probably one of the most cost-effective ways of really addressing this. So,
You're 1,000% right.
Thank you,
Mr.
Ranking
Chairman.
Member Johnson. I would note as a point of personal privilege, Senator Langford, that Senator Grassley and I have the Prison Camera Reform Act. It's passed the Senate unanimously, and any help that everybody in this room can muster getting that through the House before this Congress ends will be deeply appreciated. Senator Langford.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Thank you to both of you for your work. I have several questions on this topic and a couple of questions that are around it because it's unique to be able to sit down with both of you on that. I want to take advantage of that moment. I want to pick up Director Peters in this discussion about cameras. That was actually my first question. A common story on the sexual assault that we've heard already was that the assault was happening with staff members in locations where they were not monitored. How do we get that fixed? In the meantime, how do we make sure that until we get cameras and monitoring in those locations, we get additional staff eyes and ears in those locations, or certain policies that if you're passing through these certain locations, you can't do it one-on-one? What is in process right now?
Thank you, Senator. Well, I couldn't agree more with your sentiments or that of the Inspector General. In my 30 years in public safety, having formerly been the Inspector General of Oregon and the Director of the Oregon Department of Corrections, technology and camera usage is key. You're absolutely right. The stories we heard this morning, people know where those cameras are, both my employees and those in our care and custody, and probably more importantly, they know where those cameras are not.
Right.
And so the more that we can improve that technology inside, in my experience, I have seen this type of behavior and other non-sexual behavior decrease dramatically with the introduction of cameras, both the static cameras inside the institution and also the usage of body cameras. And so one of the concerns I have today as the new director of the Bureau is the lack of resources that we have for the camera installation. And so the time it's going to take to install these cameras that have been approved based on the resources we have is concerning to me. So always appreciate the support of Congress in establishing those resources so that we can ensure that those institutions are as safe and secure with the most upgraded technology possible.
Thank you. We appreciate that. We're going to look forward to getting a chance to be able to track what facilities were chosen first, what the process was for the rollout of that. That'll be important to be able to see as well how that actually happens and how those priorities were actually set. While I'm on the technology conversation, different subject on this, but still technology related to this, has been the microjammers and the managed access. That is a security issue not only within the prison but outside the prison for individuals to not be basically stalked from inside the prison, or people using contraband cell phones to be able to communicate with other prisoners to be able to coordinate activities within the prison as well. This has been one I've worked on for years. I've continued to be able to push. There's been pilot programs, but we've not seen wide distribution. The technology currently exists to do managed access or microjamming in all of our facilities, but it's not being rolled out quickly. What is needed to do that? Where does that land on your priority list?
So I couldn't agree more, and the Inspector General alluded to this in his opening comments. Contraband is the beginning of sexual assault. And so eradicating the use of cell phones inside our institutions for the various reasons that you just talked about, addressing this issue of drones, which is the new way to introduce contraband inside our institutions, and really figuring out how to ensure that that type of technology isn't the introduction of further criminality. So at the core of the Bureau has to be safety and security, and this issue is really important to me. And to answer your question, it's about resources. It's about funding and being able to ensure that that technology is kept outside of our institutions. Absent that funding, we are relying in some of our institutions on local law enforcement to come in with their cell dogs, if you will, their cell phone dogs, to help us figure out where those cell phones are and how to ensure that the least amount of contraband is being introduced into our institutions.
Mr. Horowitz, you want to comment on that as well?
It's something Senator, I know you have been working on and something we've been writing about for 10 years now.
Right.
Other states are doing it. Long ago, it's finally the BOP, and appreciate them finally taking that effort. But as Director Peters said, cell phones in a prison are a deadly weapon.
Right.
Deadly weapon. We did a case in Puerto Rico where it was used to put a hit on a correctional officer. They run drug businesses.
Right.
They're used to groom future abused inmates. And you know what? Smuggling a cell phone into prison is a misdemeanor.
Right. Yeah. So there are several issues that we've got to resolve here, both the disincentive to be able to bring that in, the consequences for smuggling that into, whether that be a drone or whether that be a staff member, however they may get that in, a contractor may get that cell phone in. But again, for the longest, states, local entities couldn't do this jamming because it was blocked in federal law. This is still a big issue for us, and we're still blocking the micro jamming, that the technology is there. We're acting like this is 20 years ago, but the technology is there, and the managed access where it is being used to effectively to be able to deter future crimes that are there. So I appreciate the engagement. This is an area that we've got to continue to be able to advance on, to be able to make our prisons more secure, and our staff that are there, that are the vast majority are good actors in that, to continue to be able to protect them as well. Director Peters, I want to ask you as well about the First Step Act, and this, I'm just going to make a quick comment and be able to move on to other things on this. One of the aspects of the First Step Act was actually outside groups being allowed to do the anti-recidivism work that was there. This has always been very difficult for the Bureau of Prisons to be able to allow outside entities to come and do this. It's very common in state and county facilities. There are very popular programs that are done in state and county facilities on recidivism, but the Bureau of Prisons is continuing to be able to lock them out. Even after the First Step Act is passed, many have applied, and few are actually getting in to be able to do that work. Faith-based entities and others are trying to be able to step in, and they're being blocked out to do that. I'd like to have a follow-up conversation with you and your team on this. I've met with the previous director on this, and what I really got was we're thinking about it, we're working on it. There is no requirement to do many, but it was very clear from Congress, start allowing some outside groups to work on recidivism issues within our Federal Bureau of Prisons as we do in state and federal. Will you commit to getting a chance to meet with me on that so we can get a chance to talk about it?
I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you. We do want to be able to help in that area, and Congress has spoken clearly on this. We've talked a lot about staff to inmate assaults that are there. This continues to be an issue within inmates as well. I have a culturally difficult area that you have to deal with all the time on this, and that is the transgender population that is now in the Bureau of Prisons care at this point. As of June of this year, the best numbers that I have, we have 1,427 individuals in Bureau of Prisons custodies that are transgender. Of those, 72% of those are male. Of those, 47% of those male individuals are currently incarcerated for sex crimes. So my question is, how are we protecting other inmates in that, where we have individuals that have a sex crimes conviction, they've currently transitioned already, and they're in another facility where they're biologically male in a female prison or biologically female in a male prison. Based on that, what policies are in place to be able to protect other inmates? I've read through some of the areas on the policy to be able to honor those individuals and the gender that they've chosen, but what about for other individuals that are in that prison as well, and what are you seeing?
Thank you, Senator. So this has been an issue that I have been personally working on as the former director of the Department of Corrections, and of course now as the director of the Bureau of Prisons. The bottom line answer is safety and security and individualized case management, not making sweeping decisions around our trans population, but really looking at that individual sitting in front of you, what their situation is, what is the safety and security of the institution we're consider assigning them to, and then training our employees to understand the complexities of housing individuals who are trans inside of our institutions and ensuring not just their safety, but as you said, Senator, the safety of those who are incarcerated and the safety of our employees.
Right. I appreciate that. Mr. Chairman, thank you for a little bit of extra time on this. Can I make one more follow-up statement on that? When I read through the Bureau of Prisons transgender policy, it has a section there where it says transgender inmates shall be given the opportunity to shower separate from other inmates when individual shower stalls are unavailable. The agency shall not place transgender or intersex inmates in dedicated facilities, units, or wings solely on the basis of such identification or status. That gives some rights to them. Is that also extended to other individuals? So if a biological male is placed in a female prison, do the other prisoners there also have the same rights on protecting themselves as well, to saying, hey, this is also our preference to not be housed with an individual that's a biological male, especially one that is currently incarcerated for sex crimes?
Senator, I think that obligation and that onus is on us, not those who are incarcerated. It's our obligation to ensure that we're placing them on units where they are safe and the people on those units are also safe. I wouldn't want to put that ownership on the adults in custody to determine their safety and security. That is an issue that lies with us.
But based on this policy, a transgender inmate is given the opportunity to be able to choose. What I'm asking is, do the individuals that they're housed with, do they also get that same opportunity, or is that opportunity for choice only given to the transgender inmate?
The opportunity to provide input is only given to that transgender inmate. The choice of placement is not up to the individual that is incarcerated. That is on us to make that security and housing placement.
So the opportunity to give input is not given to the other folks that they're placed with that are not transgender?
That's correct.
Why?
I think that it's really important for us to own that safety and security and that placement decision. We're the experts in corrections. We're the ones that need to determine where those individuals can be appropriately housed.
Well, you've also got a situation where some people get input and some people do not on that. And I think if you're going to give input to individuals on housing and safety and what they feel secure or their own background and perspective, I think that should be given to all in that situation.
Okay, thank you for your
Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Thank you, Senator Langford. Investigating the abuse of incarcerated women by BOP employees, I want to return to some questions about management, accountability, what's gone wrong for the last 10 years such that there's been no systemic effort to address this crisis, despite acknowledgement today from the Inspector General that it's widespread. Let me begin by saying we found approximately 5,200 allegations of sexual abuse targeting inmates by BOP employees over the last decade. As the ranking member noted, not all of them will be valid. We also heard, however, from 3 survivors in the first panel, none of whom themselves made a complaint. Given the fear of retaliation, given the power that BOP employees have over the lives of those in their custody, it stands to reason that there's a substantial number of incidents where no complaint is made. We also found to our shock that the Office of Internal Affairs, Director Peters, has an 8,000 case backlog, including at least hundreds of sexual abuse allegations. First question for you this round is, how and by when will you clear it?
Thank you, Senator. So I spoke earlier, we've added more than 40 positions to the Office of Internal Affairs to help shore up that backlog. I think when you talk about, Senator, what's gone wrong over the last 10 years, it has been lack of resources. It has been lack of accountability. When you have investigations open for as long as we've had, it's hard to hold people accountable at the end of those investigations. And so it's my hope that those additional positions will help shore up that backlog. But as you know, and from the testimony of the administrator to you from our Office of Internal Affairs, even those additional resources, it's going to require us 2 years to clear that backlog.
2 years, understood, Director Peters. Well, I hope that those sexual abuse allegations will be prioritized as you work through those 8,000 cases. And I recognize the resource constraints, but I think, Ranking Member Johnson, it's fair to say we hear pretty consistently that the solution to intractable bureaucratic deficiencies is more funding and more personnel, and sometimes that's true, but there are deeper management problems here. And so, Director Peters, I want to discuss a little bit about how you're approaching again, with the stipulation that you've been on the job for 5 months, you're new to this role, you're taking charge of the institution, and these events predated your tenure, how you're going to handle ensuring that you have all of the information about what's happening within your facilities, that the regional directors have all of the necessary information about what's happening in their facilities. I mean, how could it be, based upon your experience thus far in the role and your experience managing this organization the last 5 months, for example, that the regional director responsible for Dublin would have been unaware that the chaplain and the warden and other employees, now over a dozen investigations, were abusing inmates, such that it spilled out into the Associated Press reporting that it was dubbed, quote, the rape club? Why was the regional director unaware?
Thank you, Senator. You know, in my 18 years in adult corrections, this is one of the biggest questions I've been faced with since I've taken on this new role. Having been in institutions countless times, understanding how corrections works, the warden can't leave his or her office without people knowing. So how this type of behavior happened, unaccounted for, without people stepping forward, I don't understand it. But what I have been working on is sending very clear messages to every member of my executive team and the wardens that I must know about the good, the bad, and the ugly that's happening inside this organization, which means they too need to know. They need to know, have a pulse of what's happening in their regions and in their institutions. Going back to the previous question, it starts with the investigators. One of the changes that we made was to ensure that the investigators that are handling these very significant sexual abuse cases report to headquarters. There needs to be more accountability in headquarters. There needs to be more accountability in the director's office. And so we're going to ensure that that reporting authority is changed. And then myself and the deputy director will be meeting with the administrator of OIA and our HR division director regularly to review those cases. Also, as it relates to the broader leadership structure, we're really looking at how those appointments are made, how we recruit for those positions, who fills those positions. But I've also sent a very clear message to the organization that we are going to be transparent and that we need to be aware of what's happening inside our institutions.
All well noted, Director Peters. Returning to the question, and I think it is important that the Congress and you personally have answers to these specific questions. How is it that the regional director with direct responsibility for FCI Dublin did not know the extent of ongoing abuse in a facility for which they were directly responsible? If you have not, will you seek to speak with that person to understand how they possibly could have been blind to that severe abuse happening on their watch?
Yes, Senator.
Thank you, Director Peters. One of our courageous witnesses from the first panel, Ms. De La Rosa, who was assaulted at Lexington, described the culture of the institution as an old boys club. What do you think she meant by that?
I wouldn't want to surmise what she meant by that, Senator.
Well, I think you probably have an idea.
Senator, I think the notion of an old boys club, as I've seen and experienced in my career, is one where decisions are made often behind closed doors. They're often made without women in the room, and I assume that's what she's speaking to.
Inspector General Horowitz, you made this point in the previous round of questions. Not just that BOP employees are not reporting when they're aware of abuse that is perpetrated by their colleagues, but in fact, what we heard from the survivors who testified in the first panel is a culture of mutual protection. Talk a little bit about that, please, Mr. Horowitz.
That's one of the biggest challenges we face. You know, these are not secrets. This is the warden taking these actions, the chaplain taking these actions, other inmates taking these actions. They're not secrets. You mentioned Atlanta, the federal prison there, that was essentially closed for a period of time. When they tossed the prison to go look, we had been doing case after case there. Dozens of phones found, other contraband found. It's not a problem that happened overnight. In fact, we looked at the past audit reports. They got passes. But if you read those reports, you couldn't miss the problem. And so there needs to be more ownership at the director and senior levels of the BOP, at the regional levels of the BOP. And there has to be put in place a process by which the good actors, the people who don't want to be working next to a predator, and I think that's probably most employees, are comfortable coming forward and reporting it, knowing they're not only not going to get retaliated against for doing that, but they're going to be held on a pedestal and supported by the organization, rather than have the people who are engaged in the wrongdoing promoted.
Thank you, Mr. Horowitz. Senator Johnson.
Hey, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I'm very mindful of the fact that this hearing really is about prison personnel preying on prisoners. I got that. But I think Senator Langford brought up, I think, a pretty relevant point as well, that, certainly coming in this hearing, I was thinking about, to what extent are there sexual assaults occurring between prisoners? Director Peters, how many biological males are being housed with biological females in federal prisons?
Senator, I don't have an answer to that today.
Do we have some?
Yes, Senator.
Well, I'll just go on the record, and I won't belabor this point, but let me go on the record for when we are incarcerating somebody because they've committed a crime, we've taken away their right of moving around freely around society. I would say they have no right to determine if you're a biological male to be housed with biological females. They have no right. That is an insane policy. When we're talking about sexual assaults, to have the federal government engage in a policy that allows biological males to choose to be housed and come in close proximity with female prisoners. That is insane. And that's something Congress probably ought to address if the administration isn't smart enough to reverse this policy. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Johnson. Director Peters, let's talk about how the BOP implements the Prison Rape Elimination Act, or PREA, whose purpose is indeed in the name of the legislation. It is to eliminate prison rape. And we must dispense of any notion that there is any inevitable level or any acceptable level of sexual abuse of inmates by BOP employees. Our objective, our imperative, our moral obligation, and your moral obligation, Director Peters, as I believe you know and have stated you accept, is to eliminate sexual abuse of those in your custody. And I was pleased to hear you describe the possibility that this hearing could be a turning point. Those were your words, a turning point. Because again, and I'm repeating this so that the public viewing this hearing understands this, because it's important. You're new to this job, and the events that we're describing did not occur under your tenure. But now that you're in this role, I want to respectfully tell you that I believe your tenure will be judged by whether you succeed in eliminating the sexual abuse of those who are in your custody. I think this is your highest and most immediate moral imperative in this position. Prison Rape Elimination Act. Audits are conducted periodically to assess the compliance of BOP facilities. And it's correct, is it not, that those audits are viewed, and they've testified to it in interviews with the subcommittee by BOP leadership, as an essential tool.
That is correct, Senator.
Help us to understand, again, you were not in the role at the time, but you do need to understand this. Help us to understand how it is that, let's take Dublin and Coleman, two facilities with widespread, in the case of Dublin, high-level, ongoing sexual abuse, months, in some cases years, could both pass their PREA audits during the period in question.
Thank you, Senator, for the question. So I was with the Oregon Department of Corrections when the Prison Rape Elimination Act was passed. I was the Inspector General as we implemented those recommendations. And it's an issue that is with every corrections agency. We had hoped that those standards would eliminate sexual misconduct, as you mention it, but what we've learned is that that is only one tool in our toolbox. Those audits come in and ensure that the institution is compliant with the federal standards that were created. It doesn't address cultural issues, and so I think there are, back to my opening statements, other avenues and other tools that we need to rely on in order to work towards eliminating sexual misconduct inside of our institutions. I heard the professor speak earlier. There are concerns about how audits are conducted in some state correctional systems, as she alluded to. Some audit themselves, some rely on other jurisdictions to audit their jurisdiction, and then vice versa. At the Bureau, we do hire outside contractors to come in and conduct those pre-audits, so I think that's a step in the right direction. But again, Senator, I think the bottom line answer to your question is the pre-audits are just one tool in our toolbox.
I think we need to understand how this tool can be so ineffective that at Dublin, for example, and here is the 2017 Dublin audit, it was found that the facility met the standard of, quote, zero tolerance of sexual abuse and sexual harassment. It says that the facility meets the standard. The warden, the chaplain, others who have been convicted, allegedly over a dozen who may be under investigation at this time, were in fact engaged in sexual abuse. Here's what really, I think, stands out about this. It cites the PREA coordinator as the key source for making that finding. The PREA coordinator was sexually abusing inmates. So I understand the intent of these audits, and you and your team believe it's a key tool. It's clearly not working, right?
That's correct, Senator. It has not eliminated prison rape.
Well, I think it's not just that it hasn't eliminated prison rape, it's that it's generating false negatives at facilities where, as the Inspector General said, there's, and Mr. Horowitz, if I'm correct, your comments to the effect that if the warden and the chaplain are engaged in widespread sexual abuse of inmates, there's no way that's a secret. Mr. Horowitz, is that?
Yes.
Yeah. So you have abuse occurring at this facility that's so severe and so high level that it must have been widely known. In fact, as I said, it eventually spit out into the public. The place was called, quote, the Rape Club. But the PREA audit found that it met the standard of zero tolerance. In Coleman, again, predates your tenure. 2 days before the PREA audit was executed, every female inmate had been removed from the facility. Now, I'm not saying there was or wasn't foul play involved there, but it's true, isn't it, Director Peters, that interviewing inmates is a core part of the process of conducting a PREA audit, yes?
Yes.
And so if every female inmate had been removed from the facility 2 days before the PREA audit, those interviews could not have been properly conducted, could they have?
That's correct.
And again, Director Peters, this was before your tenure. My point is this process is badly, badly broken, and as a result, the tool that you're going to have to rely on, and I know you're also implementing these cultural assessments, and I'm eager to see how effective they are, to know what's happening in your own facilities is not currently functioning to give you the visibility that you're going to need. And if you lack that visibility, with you as the leader of reform, we're not going to be able to implement change. Let's talk a little bit about OIA processes, the Garrity precedent. Inspector General Horowitz, when prosecutions are or are not brought, what the consequences of those are. looking into Coleman, multiple BOP employees who eventually admitted in sworn statements, compelled by Bureau of Prisons, Office of Internal Affairs, admitted in graphic and explicit detail to sexual abuse of prisoners. All or most of those cases had been referred to your office as candidates for criminal prosecution. The outcome is that none of them were criminally prosecuted. And in fact, many retired with their benefits intact. How did that happen?
So I've looked at those cases, and there are multiple reasons for it. First and foremost, we need to do, as a general matter, and are doing, a more effective job at looking at these cases when they come back to us. Initially, remember, we're essentially in a triage business. We get thousands of complaints every year. We've got a dozen agents, for example, in the Florida region to cover, in our Miami field office, to cover a number of prisons throughout the Southeast. So we're doing triage initially, keeping the ones that look like they need independent oversight by us, and we are returning the vast majority to the BOP for their internal affairs to handle. It's very simply a resource question. There are only so many cases a dozen agents spending half their time on BOP work can take. So we're looking for those at the outset. BOP then investigates, and they, on occasion, when they find things, come back to us and say, we've found additional evidence. It's in particular at that stage that many of these cases came back that we probably could have done, and most of the people, by the way, are no longer in the organization because many of these happened years ago, so I haven't been able to talk to the actual decision makers. But it appears, looking at the file, that in most cases we could have taken several steps to further investigate those before deciding to send them back to the BOP again. And it was at that stage that the BOP sought to compel the officer, and of course, as has been alluded to, once an employee is compelled to speak, it means they can't invoke their Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, and anything they say is tainted from a prosecution, which is how they ended up not being prosecuted. So we need to both look at those cases that come to us with a more stringent review. We also need to make sure we are well coordinated with the Office of Internal Affairs at BOP and sharing insights, including what we're now doing with data analytics, which is looking for trends at prisons so that we can not look at these anymore as one-offs, but do they reflect a broader problem, suggesting that we might have more witnesses out there if we go in and talk to inmates. Because what we've seen, frankly, at Coleman, and I've talked to my agents about this around the country, once we go into a prison, and by the way, the 3 inmates on the first panel who said they didn't report it, we went to them because we had learned about wrongdoing in the prison and reached out to them as potential witnesses. My agents tell me this over and over again. Once inmates see us on the ground and see action being taken, like when we searched the warden's residence in connection with Dublin, we searched the warden's home during that investigation. We have been received a substantial number of complaints from inmates, several of which we've corroborated, but those happened once they saw that action. So there's a lot of things that need to occur, both on our end and on the BOP's end. And I'll go back to talking about, 2 things that would help up front: cameras, search policy, contraband penalties. Inmates are being groomed. Contraband is a huge problem. And if we had cameras, I can't tell you how many cases we have where the absence of video testimony makes it extraordinarily difficult. And one other thing that's important on the accountability front, and the credit to the Deputy Attorney General for doing this, she has told the U.S. attorneys they need to prosecute these cases. Because keep in mind, that's the other thing my agents are looking at these cases for. If there was a crime but no one's going to prosecute it, our investigating it as a criminal matter doesn't make any sense. There needs to be the partner on the receiving end, and that's been very helpful.
You mentioned the proactive monitoring of data.
Yes.
To include complaint data. My view, correct, to include complaint data?
Correct.
Yeah. My view is that both OIG and OIA need to be engaged in that. In fact, we heard from OIA that they are not doing that. And I'll enter into the record without objection some charts that we produced that show that at several of these key, most notorious facilities, there was a data signature of increased complaints in the years during which the misconduct was occurring, but before it broke into the public domain and before there was significant official action. Director Peters, will you commit to ensuring that OIA is proactively monitoring sexual assault complaint data at the facility level to get ahead of any possible major crises at a facility?
Yes, Senator, the Inspector General and I just met a couple of weeks ago, and he talked about this notion of data analytics, and I went back and talked to my team. We certainly want to be looking at the exact same data that the Inspector General is looking at, so that we see that information parallel to him looking at it. And so our Office of Internal Affairs is looking forward to that collaboration and ensuring that we're monitoring the same sets of data.
And keep in mind, most of the data we receive are the referrals we get from the BOP. The ones we can't share with the BOP are the whistleblower complaints, the inmates who come straight to us that need confidentiality. So short of that data, we should have the same data.
Well, I think proactively monitoring that data is going to be essential. And Inspector General Horowitz, you noted that in those Coleman cases, at least in several of them, OIA brought them back.
Correct.
But still no prosecution was brought. And as a result, those folks face no criminal penalties for pretty egregious acts. Clearly, it sounds that you are engaged in, and change is necessary. And I understand you both face resource constraints, but this is a crisis that requires immediate action. We're gonna close now. Just a couple final thoughts for you. Director Peters, I have been genuinely encouraged by the tone of your tenure thus far, by the ambitious reform objectives that you've set out in public. And when we've met in private and during these public engagements, I've encouraged you to make good on those intentions and those promises. And I want to encourage you again to embrace the possibility that you can turn this agency around with everything that you've got. And I think you should expect that so long as I have the ability, I will be calling you back to the Senate to ask what progress you've made. And the one thing that concerned me from today's discussion is that your admirable plans for reform, which I hope you implement with speed and strength, need to be informed by a fulsome understanding of what's gone wrong in the past. And when we investigated Atlanta, what we heard from your predecessor was that he was blind, in my view, willfully blind, but blind to what was happening at the regional level and at the facility level. And the regional director didn't know what was happening at the facility level. You will be held accountable for knowing. And I believe you have an opportunity to establish a legacy as a reformer who saves lives and protects vulnerable people from sexual assault, one of the most heinous things that can happen to any human being. This has to stop. You have the power to stop it. I also hope that you will be responsive to the U.S. Congress. And I want to note that we are still awaiting answers to specific questions regarding U.S. Penitentiary Atlanta that were submitted following that July 26th hearing. You need to set the tone within your organization and working with DOJ's Office of Legislative Affairs that responsiveness to the Senate is essential. Because it's not an encouraging sign when we are stymied in our efforts to conduct oversight. So thank you for your commitment to change, and please make good on it. Please cooperate fully with our efforts to support reform. We should be working together to make these changes. This will be the final hearing for the Permanent Subcommittee of Investigations this Congress. I believe that the work that we've done investigating conditions of incarceration and detention in the United States has been among the most substantive and focused effort in the history of the U.S. Congress. We have investigated corruption and misconduct at Bureau of Prisons facilities. We've investigated the medical mistreatment of women in DHS custody. We've investigated failures to implement the Death in Custody Reporting Act. We are now continuing to investigate the sexual abuse of women in federal custody. And this work will continue. Accountability will continue. Both of you have key roles to play in making sure that when I close this hearing, that's not the end of this. It's the turning point that you referenced in your opening remarks, Director Peters. Thank you both for your testimony, and the hearing is adjourned.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Senator.